The Amazing Hypnotic Bedtime Story. Preface for audiobook listeners. Hello, dear friends, and thank you for showing up to listen to my audiobook. I have put this little extra introduction part at the beginning for you, just in case the title of this book causes some confusion. Please allow me a moment to explain. As many of you already know, I have several hypnotic bedtime stories available for free on the internet. One of the most popular ones is called The Amazing Hypnotic Bedtime Story. It doesn't have much of a plot, but it is a nice little guided visualization that can certainly help you relax and feel better while you fall asleep. I also have a hypnotic bedtime story with a generic title and a series of creepypasta stories that can be grouped under the title Red 11. This book is loosely based on the Red 11 story. So why am I calling it The Amazing Hypnotic Bedtime Story if it doesn't have much to do with the original, other than this book is a hypnotic bedtime story and I would like to think it is amazing? I'm doing this for two reasons. First, to be perfectly honest, it's just a great title. So good I would like to use it again. I'm putting a lot of time and energy into writing this book, and I would like it to be as successful as it can be, so I'm going with the best title I can think of. The second reason relates to the first. For this to work, I would have to have the best story possible. And the Red 11 story takes us into a complex world where interesting things happen. Instead of being a pleasant guided visualization into an exclusively happy world, it is a real story with a plot. The Red 11 story is more interesting and something your brain can really sink its teeth into. I would like this to be a page-turner, but given who I am and what I do, this might not be the best way to go about things. If you are familiar with my work and would prefer the relaxing, hypnotic type of story you have already enjoyed, I don't think you will be disappointed. Beginning with Chapter 1, this audiobook contains all of the hypnotic and meditative techniques I have been using for years to help people relax and feel good while they go to sleep. As you are listening to this audio, you may notice there is something going on the screen. I have put these images together for you, just in case you don't feel like closing your eyes and going to bed just yet. These clips will represent things that are happening, have happened, or are going to happen later on in the story. And these will be your visual experience throughout your adventure. Over the next year, I hope to release this audiobook movie in 11 episodes of about an hour long each. So this is a big project. Whether or not it is completed depends largely on your support. If you are currently viewing this video for free on YouTube, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, favorite, share, or donate. Watch, listen again, and watch or listen often if you really like what I'm doing. This will let me know better quality, labor-intensive content is preferable. Before we go into the introduction, I would just like to take a brief moment here to sincerely thank my YouTube audience for what you have done for me already over the past 6 years. This has been the experience of a lifetime, and I am honored and thrilled to serve you. I don't always have the time to answer all of your comments, and YouTube's interface doesn't make it convenient to do so, but I do keep the notifications turned on, so as I work or just watch TV, your comments pop up on my screen, and I thank you. Sometimes I even reply out loud because I live alone and my cats are used to this kind of thing. So even if I don't reply in person, know what you have said is appreciated. Now that you have been appropriately loved as you so richly deserve, it is time to move on to the introduction part of the book. The Amazing Hypnotic Bedtime Story, Introduction. Hello, dear reader. My name is Jody. I am here to tell you a bedtime story that might be a little bit different from the bedtime stories you grew up with or read to your children today. This is a hypnotic bedtime story for grown-ups. I say grown-ups instead of adults because when I tell people I am writing an adult book, sometimes they get the wrong idea. The hypnotic bedtime story is something I tried out on YouTube many years ago that caught on much better than I expected. I have uploaded many of them since the first one was published on this platform years ago. They have brought in millions of views, and other content creators have joined in the fun. So now I guess I could safely say hypnotic bedtime stories have become a thing on YouTube. If you like the idea of listening to something that is both relaxing and entertaining while you fall asleep, I encourage you to check out my stories and those created by other people as well. I began writing and reading these stories that include hypnotic techniques to help people relax and feel good while they fall asleep as a means of entertainment for those who can't sleep or take a long time to fall asleep and don't want to be bored or kept awake by something more stimulating. Before I continue with this introduction, I would just like to include a little side note here. There is a man who goes by the name of Not Ryan Falk. He made several hypnosis videos for YouTube I liked very much. In a few of these videos, he did some hypnosis-y things, then guided the listener through some interesting dreams that he had dreamed. I must give him credit here for being a big part of the creation of the idea of the hypnotic bedtime story. I may have softened things up a bit and told stories instead of my dreams, but the ideas are similar, and I really liked listening to his videos. It is also possible someone else was doing hypnotic bedtime stories before me, and I'm just not aware of it. So I'm being cautious about claiming full credit for the idea. I'm writing this book because I like to read before I go to bed. This is something I picked up from my parents, who always had a book on their bedside tables that they would read for about 20 minutes to relax before they went to sleep. This is a bedtime book for people who like to read to relax at bedtime, and maybe for people who don't usually do this, but would like to try something to help them wind down after a long day and fall asleep more easily. The one thing you may notice when you read the story is most of this story is told in the second person. This means you are the main character and the story is about you. You will be guided into an interesting alternate reality where you are encouraged to picture the events happening to you as they unfold. This is because guided visualization is a powerful tool to use when you would like to relax, fall asleep easily, and have good dreams. Another reason is things are so much more interesting when they are happening to you as opposed to someone else, and bedtime should be your time just for you and all about you, and it might be the only time you have when you don't have anyone else to think about, figure out, worry about, or do anything for. I do break this second person rule during the prologue. The prologue is a short story before the story that can provide some interesting information and history about the location to help you better understand the much longer work that is to follow. Many parts of this tale are written using conversational hypnosis techniques, but please do not be afraid. The only suggestions embedded in this text are for you to relax and have fun falling asleep. I can guarantee you will not begin clucking like a chicken at any time, unless you like to cluck like a chicken and it is your idea to do so. If this is the case, I will remain blameless. As a daily meditator, I couldn't resist bringing some of the best of what I have learned to help your mind be at ease and your heart be at peace. So I'm sure for some, this might also have some therapeutic value as well. It is my sincerest wish you will find something in these pages that makes your life in any little way better than it was before. And if you like this story, please check out my YouTube channel where there are hundreds of videos all made to help your bedtime experience be one of the favorite parts of your day. And now, on to the prologue. The prologue. In a place that has no name, in the year 50,000 BC, give or take a few years, there were no people to see the fireball streak across the sky, and we have no record of what they may have thought about it. No one saw it land. Unlike previous meteors that had visited our planet, this one was not so rude as to come crashing down, causing mass destruction. After burning its way through the atmosphere, it stopped, hovered, then gently floated down to rest upon the earth. Over the next 1,000 years or so, it nestled into the ground, deep enough to be shaded and hidden from view, yet at its apex not so deep as to not feel the warmth of the sun or sense what was happening in the world above. When the first people arrived, they could sense its energy, and the place where its peak was closest to the surface was declared sacred. Only the wise ones could go there. We don't know if the white people were warned about this place of such great power, Maybe the natives thought it was better if they figure it out on their own. Or perhaps they were told and discounted it as nonsense. Either way, the original inhabitants were moved onto reserves, and the land was made available to settlers of European descent. Port Sarnia, 1873. The Tierney brothers, both Clem and Abraham, landed in the little community of Port Sarnia by accident. During a long and inauspicious journey from the west, where their dreams of fame and fortune had gone bust, they were put off the boat where Lake Huron meets the St. Clair River, for being afflicted with an unknown illness that frightened their fellow passengers. Terrified and alone, they huddled together on the dock, fevered and with nothing in their stomachs or bowels to expel, too weak to go anywhere, embracing one another like the dear friends they were, and waited for whatever fate had in store for them. The sound of shuffling busy feet on the wooden planks of the dock suddenly quieted, replaced by a hollow clump, clump, bump, and again clump, clump, bump. This sound was the sound of heavy footsteps and a cane. Clem, the older of the two, looked up to notice an old crone steadily making her way towards them. She was dressed as a dusty heap of dirty rags. Her face was pale in the shadows of a moth-eaten shawl. Sharp, dark, coal-colored eyes peered out and were trained upon them, unwavering, and holding Clem's gaze as she approached. When she finally arrived, she stiffly bent over, cocked her head slightly and smiled, showing orderly rows of perfect teeth. Then she leaned in closer and said, "You're coming with me." Her breath was a warm wind that smelled of moss and peppermint. The widow Spiller, formerly the widow Montjay, had come to Port Sarnia as a pretty young woman, barely out of her teens, many years ago when the settlement was still known as the Rapids. She was attracted by the promise of free land and abundant available men, eager to marry. She was not disappointed, and within a few weeks of her arrival was wed to a handsome and strapping young man called Andrew Montjay, who had recently acquired Lot 25, one of the many narrow 200-acre parcels of land that ran from Michigan Road to the lake. The lot would need to be cleared and tilled, yet the first time Annabel Elliott held a handful of the black moist earth from Lot 25, she felt the magic of it and knew she must join herself to this place for a lifetime. So she married who owned it and set him to work making it be just the way she would like it to be. She was never seen in the church and held herself aloof from the other women in the community, quickly earning their scorn. Bereft of any real information to go on, the town gossips were placed in the position of having to make things up about who Annabel was and where she had come from. And the silver-haired beauty with the unlikely striking black eyes didn't seem to mind one bit. She was a woman on a mission, as mysterious as it may be, and she was not wont to be distracted by nasty looks or whispers. The formerly friendly Montjay also turned his back on the community and bent it to heavy toil. Gossips and men of good sense alike spoke in hushed tones about the changes they were to see in young Andrew, whispering as if there were some spirit that would overhear them if they spoke too loudly. The fact that they didn't see him very often made how different he was becoming stand out in stark contrast to previous sightings. And each time he was seen, it would send another wave of theories about what was going on at the Montjay place circulating among the residents. He was becoming thin and drawn. His skin was wrinkling prematurely, and it had taken on a grey, flaky appearance. He seemed to shrink in stature, but perhaps that was because his back had become bent. His previously confident gait was being replaced by a slow shuffle, and his dry, sandpapery hands had a fine tremor and never seemed to know where to rest. Most blamed it on how quickly Lot 25 was being cleared, and how hard Andrew had been working. Some had even seen him working through the night by torchlight, so there was little question as to why he was withering. The land from Michigan Road all the way to the last 50 acres had been cleared and was fit for planting by the time Andrew dropped dead in the woods. What was left of him was found by Thomas Spiller from the farm next door, who had heard Andrew calling out in the forest for a drink of water. Ordinarily, the townfolk would reach out to a young widow in a predicament, but this was not the case for Annabel. She was left to mourn in her little cabin alone. The one exception to her isolation was aid delivered by her neighbors, the Spillers. The Spillers were a middle-aged couple, active in the church and more Christian than most, who saw to it that Andrew had a good Christian burial, and they left baskets of food on the widow Montjay's front doorstep. When Annabel was conspicuously absent at the funeral, the Spillers kindly said it was because she was prostrate with grief. The Spillers had come to the Rapids from Toronto 2 years earlier, were well heeled enough to hire help, and had already established a working farm on Lot 26. They were solid people in both build and temperament. They were welcomed, well-liked, and were included in the church community and all of its functions to the point where some might say they were almost running things. No one felt any resentment about this, for the Spillers were possessed of an assertive kindness people were wont to defer to. Spiller common sense was a good thing, as were their generous donations to the church and the community projects they often organized. The Rapids inhabitants were glad to have the Spillers take care of the widow Montjay's situation and leave them out of it. There was something hard to define about Annabel that put them ill at ease. The gossips credited Annabel with her husband's early demise. After several months, even the most prying of gossips gave up asking Mrs. Spiller about Annabel, because there was never anything interesting to report. Widow Montjay had become a recluse. Mrs. Spiller kept on leaving and collecting the baskets of food, and she had not spoken to her neighbor. Just before Easter of that year, Mrs. Spiller suddenly died of a heart attack during choir practice. Thomas stoically bore his grief and seemed unaware of how inappropriate it felt to the rest of the community that he should live next door to the ostracized widow. A 12-year-old girl was hired, or more accurately bought, from a family that was prolific, prone to drink, and on the road to ruin. She would live with Thomas to cook, clean, and settle the hearts and minds of the church folk. A year passed and Mr. Spiller had resumed all of his duties. He brought the mousy, quiet child called Ginny to church with him, and was tending to her education. Some began to assume Ginny might make a decent wife for him someday. This is why it was such a shock when he casually dropped the bombshell one Sunday after service that he would be marrying Annabel Montjay. Everyone was too stunned to speak, and not one of them had time to collect themselves before Thomas and the widow were married in a small private ceremony that evening. By next Sunday, the newlyweds and their charge were sitting in the pew together, singing hymns as if nothing unusual was happening. If anyone did think it was a good idea to say anything to Annabel, one look from her told them otherwise. She had a harsh, piercing glare that instantly shut the bravest of mouths. Withdrawn Ginny was not considered worthy of attention given her family situation. Perhaps she would have earned her place with the ladies in time, had she not chosen a different path. The Spiller women, as they were referred to, were seen with him often. They were there, but not really there in a social sense. Thomas didn't seem to mind, appeared happy enough, and this was good enough for all involved to stay quiet and be glad for him. 2 years went by and Ginny was less frequently seen, then wasn't seen at all for several months. After this time she could be found in the local tavern, taken to drink and practicing the world's oldest profession. If she did tell anyone what it was like to live with the Spillers, the information would have been useless, because no respectable person would dare claim they had anything to do with her. There weren't any children produced by either Spiller marriage. Thomas was not a young man at the time he married Annabel, yet he was fortunate enough to live another 30 years in peace and contentment before he died quietly in his bed while taking an afternoon nap, leaving 400 acres of productive land, minus the 50 acres of wood, left that way in Andrew's memory, to the widow Spiller. She buried him and attended his funeral, though none spoke to her, and by now this felt normal. She went home to her house, where there were no baskets of food left for her, closed the door, and was not seen or heard from till this day on the dock, when all stopped and made way for her. The only people who didn't know who she was were Clem and Abraham, for even if she hadn't been seen in over a decade, the stories, real and imagined, had been told to all, grew taller as they were passed along, and were often used to frighten children into doing as they were told. The brothers were fed, nursed, and tended to kindly in a dusty old house by the woman who rescued them on the dock. They recovered quickly, and the widow told them they had been suffering from food poisoning. Abraham guiltily remembered some dried deer sausage he bought in Manitoba. Clem told him it was starting to smell funny. Abraham ate it anyway and insisted Clem do likewise. Grateful for care and shelter, they began cleaning up the long-neglected farm. Hard work made for healthy appetites that caused them not to question what was in the food cleverly prepared from what was gathered in the woods and field out back. The widow was much younger than she originally appeared to be. She had discarded the heaps of rags she was wearing when they first met her, and was dressed smartly, if not for her garb being so many years out of date. The cane was gone, and she walked well. Her glinting coal-black eyes now danced and sparkled as she would often toss her head of silver hair and laugh at any joke either of them told. One evening, as they were gathered round the fire drinking mulberry wine, after a delicious dinner of rabbit pie made with a ground acorn crust, Annabel offered these young gentlemen an enchanting opportunity. She said they could have the back 100 acres by the lake to live on till she passed on, and she would leave the rest of the property to them in her will. The only conditions were that the 50 acres by the wood were to be left as they were and never be cleared, and near the center of the woodlot, not too far from the lake, a well was to be put in memory of her first love. She explained the woods were his to be cleared or not, and he died in that spot of overwork and dehydration, calling out for water, so it would be fitting to honor him in this way. The brothers were thrilled, and Annabel donned her dusty crone disguise one more time to go into town to take care of the legalities before the digging began. She took them to a perfectly round clearing near the center of the woodlot, where there were several small piles of rough-hewn stones, all about 1 foot square. Around these stones were patches of white dust that looked the same as the dust in the house and on the widow's clothes. Annabel went to one of the piles and softly caressed a stone, reverently saying, "I made these myself, using only stone on stone. They are to line the well, and many generations will drink from it and be saved." To the brothers, it sounded more like she was praying than talking to them, so they quietly waited for her to contemplate the stones for a few more minutes before her head snapped up and she smiled and said, "Well, I'll leave you boys to get on with it." And she disappeared into the woods. The digging of the well was far easier than expected. Under the moss and soft black earth was a sparkling fine white gravel that graciously gave way to their shovels, yet somehow knew not to flow into what was already dug. When Abraham struck solid rock, Clem answered his curses with encouragement, as Clem had already discovered the white stone had already been cleared in a perfectly clean circle, neatly bored into the exact center of where they were digging, and this afforded a 1-foot shelf on which to begin placing Annabel's blocks. One might think they should find this unusual, but they didn't, because as they were shoveling the gravel into piles by what would soon be the well, a feeling of peaceful well-being came upon them that caused them to think all was beautiful and right with the world. As the last stone block was placed on the shelf to line the well, Annabel appeared to tell them it was time for dinner. Not one of them showed any signs of fatigue, despite the long day of work, and the brothers laughed often, in high spirits, as they told her how easy this well will be to complete. They eagerly agreed when Annabel told them they were to spread the pretty gravel along the paths to turn the magic woods into a wonderland they could visit and explore any time they felt like they would like to feel better than they already did. On the second day, buckets and ropes were brought to haul up the sparkling rocks and spread them along the several small winding paths that intersected the forest. The same euphoric energy that made for happy work the day before stayed with them as the sun rose and near set. Before the day was over, water welled up into Abraham's boots, and Clem helped haul him up as the last load. They were so busy jumping for joy, hugging each other, and patting each other on the back, it took them a while to notice Annabel sitting on the ground by the well. She had brought a small silver bucket with her and was gulping the water as they made towards her to include her in the celebrations. The look she gave them stopped them in their tracks. They had never seen the striking, sharp look on her face, and high spirits instantly vanished. In a low tone that was almost a growl, she said, "I want to be alone." They said nothing and quickly made their way along the gravel path to the back field and the house. A dinner of fried fish, some kind of tuber mashed with herbs, and raspberry wine waited for them, and they drank more of the wine than they usually would, waiting up well past midnight for their benefactor to return. When the brothers were in their cups, it was traditional for them to speak about their dreams and plans for a prosperous future, but on this night they were silent. They felt somehow guilty, but couldn't exactly figure out why. A long, mournful owl's call was followed by Clem announcing it was time for bed, and both brothers fell into a deep and dreamless sleep, seconds after their heads lay upon their pillows. The sun was high in the sky by the time they awoke, and Annabelle was nowhere to be found. They dawdled and took their time walking back to the well. They found sticks and used them to swat at leaves and grasses on their way, as if this activity had some kind of purpose. They were still being uncharacteristically quiet, so neither one mentioned they didn't know why they knew something they didn't want to know. They found Annabelle sprawled on the mossy ground at the edge of the well. The water in the well had flowed up to within inches of overflowing the stones that had been placed there. This was strange, but not as strange as the water itself. It seemed to sparkle and glow ever so slightly in a way that was reminiscent of the gravel the brothers were standing upon. They both backed away from the scene slowly, then simultaneously broke into a run, stopping only when they fell into the heavy armchairs in front of the fireplace, releasing 2 clouds of dust that would hang in the air undisturbed for many hours, till they found the courage to get up and take care of business. One of the first things they did as the owners of their new property was bring in cartloads of dirt and sand and fill in the well. Neither one of them ever entered the woods again. City of Sarnia, 1941. Up until this day, young Frank Nero had had about as an unfortunate history as could be imagined for an orphan in Ontario. His 16-year-old unwed mother had died of an infection 3 days after naming him for a father who could not be found. He was given to the Sisters of the Sacred Heart to raise. He was a small and unattractive infant, with weak, twisted limbs and small, beady eyes that always appeared half-closed. He seldom smiled, often whined, and even the kindest of nuns struggled to like him. As he grew, he was sent away to farms as free labor or businesses as an apprentice, but he was always returned due to what was seen as laziness and dullness of intellect. Today, of course, we may note that his mother, Mary Tierney, was prone to drink. Some of the sisters were quite cruel to him to try to make him more obedient. Before he was in his teens, he had fled the shelter of the church and lived on the streets for a time, alone and finding shelter where he could, till he was caught stealing food and sent to prison. He was to be released on his 21st birthday when news came to him that he had inherited a farm with a goodly sum of money. There were those who tried to advise him, but he was unteachable as he sold the land, saved the 50 wooded acres by the lake, and used all of his money to build 50 houses, one on each acre of land. In front of the abandoned well, he placed a little cottage just for himself. He also claimed a small slice of land leading between the lots up to the lake as his own private beach access. Joining all of this together was a small winding road that he aptly named Green Acres Road. 1941 was not a good year to build houses. His small body, weak limbs, and dull intellect saved him from any kind of military service, so to him the war didn't really matter, but it did matter to a great many other people, and these great new houses stood vacant and unsold as the war raged on overseas. Frank may have been forced to sell for pennies on the dollar, or more likely would have been sent back to jail for stealing, but for the sudden and very unexpected arrival of his father. Frank Nero Sr. was a handsome, slick, smooth operator who bared little, if any, resemblance to the person who was alleged to be his son. He moved into the little cottage by the lake, and with a winning smile and an open wallet, soon became quite a hit in the pool halls and taverns downtown. No one was sure or really cared what young Frank Jr. thought about this, and was only seen in public one more time after the arrival of his long-lost father. This appearance was to will his holdings to his father in the event of his early demise, and to pick up a tombstone he had purchased already engraved as Frank Nero, 1920 to 1948. The lawyer who had handled this affair later reported over a pint of beer that the son had told him he was to be trusted with seeing that the property behind his property never be cleared, and it was young Frank's wishes that he be buried by the well. For some reason, all in attendance, including Frank Sr., thought this was funny. The older Frank set himself up in business as a bootlegger. His most valuable product was called Easy Glow, a mulberry wine that glowed ever so slightly in the dark. Given the high demand and short supply, only those in a position to do him a special favor from time to time were allowed to buy Easy Glow, and of course, it wasn't cheap by any stretch of the imagination. When the war was over, the houses sold, and young Frank died of alcohol poisoning in 1948. He drank 3 cases of Easy Glow by the well and passed away peacefully in his sleep. His father had his body cremated, scattered the ashes about the well, and used the tombstone to make a couple of steps leading up from the patio to the backyard. Frank Sr. continued his little business in peace for the next 60 years, till he died, much the way his son had, at 101 years of age. Toronto, Ontario, 2008. Donna Marco had never spoken to either one of her biological parents, but she had been keeping tabs on her birth father ever since she turned 25 10 years earlier. This is when her adopted parents told her about him. She wasn't happy to learn she had been abandoned in the hospital by a teenaged mother who simply said her boyfriend, Frank Nero, didn't want any children. But it was nice to know Frank was advanced in age, quite wealthy, and had no spouse or heirs. The cottage she inherited was a 3 to 4 hour drive away. She worked as a high school English teacher, was married to a police officer, and had 2 preteen sons. They already owned a modern cottage up north, and this property had become somewhat neglected and out of date, so it was decided it should be rented out, and the extra money would be set aside as a retirement investment. This turned out to be more trouble than it was worth. The cottage was frequently vacant, and no one wanted to live there for very long at a time. After several years of inconvenience, the cottage was put up for sale and sold 3 years later at a drastically reduced price. It was bought by an investor who lived on the West Coast. He handed it over to a property management company to be let out as a vacation rental, and this is a good thing, because very soon you are going to have an interesting vacation there, and probably save the world while you do. Till then, I will bid you a good night, and see you next time over at Chapter 1.